This is John England, and I wanted to give you a little insight into how these self-paced classes work and what they look like. This is about one little section in the code book talks about a three-story building per the IRC and how we explain all the differences for this one little code section. After the short demo here, you'll be able to take a 5-question quiz, which is typical of the way we're doing these classes. Let's start with chapter 1 and section 101.2. And basically, the IRC is for all detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses, not more than 3 stories above the grade plane in height. Well, that one little sentence tells a whole bunch, because first it's going to talk about 1 and 2 family or duplexes and townhouses. And basically, here's where it comes in, 3 stories above the grade plane. So we have to first define 3 stories and also the grade plane. So let's look at this typical house here. This house is pretty easy. I mean, it's 3 stories. It's a single family house, not so bad. So what basically happens when you go to a 4-story house? When it gets above 3 stories, I got 1, 2, 3, 4 here on this artist rendering. Because actually on the roof, I got another story up here. So what really happens once you go to 4 stories? Well, it's going to get kicked back to the IBC. Now, it's only going to get kicked back for the structural, not mechanical, plumbing, or electrical from the IRC. And it's going to be going to a 4-story wood, and it's going to be type 5B. And you will have to sprinkle it per the IBC. And wood must have an engineer design since it's 4 stories, because remember in the IRC, it's a prescriptive one, and we're limited to 3 stories. Before we can talk about how many stories a building is, first we got to talk about a grade plane. This comes out of chapter 2 definitions. And it's a reference plane representing the average of the finished ground level adjoining the building at all exterior walls. Where the finished ground level slopes away from the exterior walls, the reference plane shall be established by the lowest point within the areas between the building and the lot line, or where the lot line is more than 6 foot from the building between the structure and a 0.6 foot from the building. So if you got on a little demo here, this house is on like a little hill, and we're not going to measure it right at the building. We're going to measure it up to 6 foot away from the building at the lowest point. Now, at the top here, it's right at the building, but down here, it gets further away. So let's take an average, and it says an average. So if you take a typical building like this, and we talk about the average, we can see at the top here, it's 124.5. And at the bottom here, up 6 foot away, it's going to be 122.5. So it's basically a difference of 2 feet. So basically what we're going to do here, and just for everybody's information, the 124.5 is 124 feet, 0.6 inches above mean sea level, which is halfway between low tide and high tide. These are surveyor's marks. You'll see these a lot on plans. So we're going to have an average of 123.5. So that's our average plane for this house. So the grade plane is a big deal. We also have to go to the next definition about story. Story is a portion of a building between the upper surface of a floor and the upper surface of the floor or roof above. Story above the grade plane. And I'm not going to read every word here. More than 6 foot above the grade plane, or more than 12 feet above the finished ground at any given point. These are 2 definitions that's hard to understand. Ever since I've been in here, these are 2 that's been misrepresented a lot. We're going to explain these. Also, you need to talk about a basement. And it's a different definition. A story that is not a story above grade plane. The opaque portion of a wall that encloses one side of a basement that has an average below grade wall area that's 50% or more of the total opaque or non-opaque area of the enclosing side. We're going to explain what a basement is too, because it makes a difference on how you build these 1 and 2 family house, 3 stories. So here's your good little split level house, and you have kind of like a basement here, I guess. But because this basement, let's assume right here where the yellow line is, that basement is 8 foot tall. And it's about 3 foot below the ground and probably 4 or 5 foot above the ground. So it's more than 50% of this is out of the ground. We're going to count that as a story. So basically this is a 2-story house. If it was buried more in the ground and had window wells, it would become a one-story house. Another definition we have to talk about is a finished or unfinished area not considered a story, complying with all of the following. It's called a habitable attic. An occupiable floor area of not less than 70 square foot. The occupied floor area has a ceiling in accordance with section 305, which basically means it's at least an average of 7 foot. And the occupiable space is enclosed by the roof assembly above the knee walls on the sides and the floor assembly below. So you take room over the garage or an attic or something like that, and it's called a habitable attic. It's going to have a set of stairs to it and all of that. This is not considered a story. Something else that we have to mention is mezzanine, another definition. And a mezzanine is an intermediate level or levels between the floor and the ceiling above. And you have to go all the way back to section 325 under mezzanines to get a real definition of what a mezzanine is. And if you see right here under 325.2, it says a clear ceiling above or below the mezzanine should be not less than 7 foot. So you got to have a 7 foot head height below it and one up where the bed area is here. The aggregate area of the mezzanine or mezzanine should not be greater than 1/3 of the floor area of the room or space which they're located. So basically, if you have this floor space right here and you got 300 square foot, the mezzanine can only include about 100 square foot. It's 1/3 of the area. There's some exceptions to that. The enclosed portion of the room shall not be included in determining the floor area of the room in which the mezzanine is located. So it's only the open area. If you got like a bathroom down here in this picture, I guess that's a bathroom, you're not going to count that as part of the open area of the floor. It's only what's open in the floor here. There's an exception to this. The aggregate area of the mezzanine located within a dwelling unit equipped with a fire sprinkler system, 13D, shall not be greater than 1/2. So once you sprinkle it, you go from 1/3 to 1/2 of the floor area. There's exceptions for closets and bathrooms. The opening of the room is unobstructed, not for more than 42 inches in height for the post. Here's my post. The exceptions in R325 does not apply. Now, you got to have an openness here. 325.5 is an openness. Mezzanine shall be open and unobstructed to the room below, except for walls not more than 36 inches in height. Basically, you can put a rail on the mezzanine. Here's your rail. Basically, you'd put a wall there if you wanted to, but you put a rail there, okay? Mezzanines and portions are not required to be open to the room in which they're located. Basically, if you can enclose 10% of the floor area of the mezzanine. We're going to talk about this. In buildings that are not more than 2 stories above the grade plane equipped throughout with an automatic sprinkler system in accordance with section 313, a mezzanine should not be required to be open. So once you sprinkle it, I don't have to open it no more. Here's your mezzanine right here. This is kind of a good example of a mezzanine. It's actually most probably larger than the floor area below it because you can see where it's enclosed below. So at this point, since this is larger than the floor area below, whether you sprinkle it or not, it's not a mezzanine no more. It's another floor. Here's another good example of a mezzanine. Or is it? Because I've enclosed this so much up here, it's enclosed more than 10%. It's not considered part of the floor below either. So now it's another story. So you got to really understand mezzanines to see if it's a 1-story or 2-story here. Now, let's talk about one more thing. The basement. Here's your lookout or walkout basement. And it talks about 50%. And as you can see right here, more than 50% of this basement is underground. Just by looking at the picture, you can tell it's over here high. It's only the lookout portion that's open. Since more than 50% of it is there, then guess what? It's not considered a story either. Okay. Now, let's look at some pictures. 1 story with a walkout basement. Let's look at some pictures here. This is the house at the beach. Since this beach house is raised more than 6 foot off the grade plane, and it's pretty easy to see this. You can walk under it 6-7 foot. That first floor is a story. The second floor is a story. The third floor is a story. But you have this little deck on top. Well, it's not enclosed. It's a building official's call whether this is a story or not, but I would consider this a 3-story building. Here's another one. You got a 1-story, 2-story. Is that a 3rd story or is that a habitable attic? That's the first thing you got to ask. Also have what they call a widow's walk or a captain's watch up there. Depends on where you're at in the country. I know down in Key West, they call it a captain's watch. In Charleston and Savannah, they call it a widow's walk because the widows used to walk up here and look for their husbands to come back from sea. In Key West, they call it a captain's watch because they look for shipwrecks. So in this instance, do you count this as another story? Since it's not really a room, it's just basically a bell tower up there, for lack of better words, or a deck on top. I'm actually count this as a 2-story building. I got 1 floor, 2 stories, I got a habitable attic, and I got a deck on top of the building. It gets even more cumbersome here. Is this a 1-story, 2-story, 3-story building? Well, because this is raised more than 50% and it's out of the ground more than 50% and it's raised at least 6 feet, I'm going to count this as a 1, 2, 3-story building because this is enclosed on top. Here's another good beach house. I got parking underneath. Well, that's the floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, and habitable attic. So that's a 3-story building also. It's kind of interesting. I'll give you a little sideline here. In South Carolina, a residential contractor could build a 3-story building. They had to go back to the legislature and change it, and a residential contractor can build 3 living floors. So whether you call this a 3 or 4-story building, residential contractor could build this because this is not a living floor on the first. That's an argument you could have. Here's another beach house, raised over 6 foot off the ground. I don't care if you use it for storage or not. So I got 1-story, 2-story, 3 stories, and a habitable attic. Here's your one on a hill. And basically right here, you got the 1st floor here, which is a basement because it's a lookout or walkout basement. I got story number 1 here. And if you consider this a habitable attic, even though it's got a deck, this is probably just a 1-story building. Could argue it'd be a 2-story building. So let's look at this. Let's look at a typical house here. And let's see how many stories we actually have. Since the 1st floor down here is more than 50% of the ground, that's the basement. It doesn't count as a story. Of course, I got story number 1 here. I got a mezzanine here that's 250 square foot, which is less than a third of the 1,000. I can enclose 10% of that, which is 25 square foot, but I only enclose 10, so I'm okay. So that's the 2nd story because mezzanine doesn't count. I got a 3rd story building up here, and also I got an uninhabitable attic. So if you really want to know how many story building this is, it's actually a 3-story building. Unless, don't forget the other little thing about what a story above grade plane is. If this height right here in this basement is more than 12 foot above grade, it counts as a story, which would kick me out of the IRC and send me to the IBC. Here's your one on a hill. This is a lookout basement. But of course, now that because this is more than 12 foot, that becomes 1 floor, 2 floors, and a habitable attic. How many stories is this? There's more than 12 foot here. But it's not basically a basement. It's just a walk under. You could argue that's a 1-story. This is a 2-story. This top floor is not enclosed at all. It's just a roof. So most probably this is just no more than a 1-story building. No finished floor or no finished area below it. It's just part of the hill. So when you start looking at the story above the grade plane, you first have to understand grade plane. You also have to understand basement, mezzanine, habitable attic, and also these 2 key components come into play here. More than 6 foot above the grade plane and more than 12 foot above the finished ground at any given point. Now, when you get to the commercial book, which we'll talk about later in a different lesson, this story takes on a whole new meaning. But in residential code, this should explain it fairly well. And until we see you for a real lesson and part of a class, whether it's CEU or one to take the ICC test, hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much.